Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the PSP Go, the PlayStation P Go that came out in 2009, and see how this particular gaming console is holding up in 2024. Now, the craziest thing, and this is still so insane to me, when I look at my PSP Go that I have right here, it's still insane to me how good of a job Sony did with the concept of this particular console. You have to keep in mind, as I've kept in mind throughout the last couple of years, this was a proof of concept. This was not Sony's, main console they were trying to go, and build and replacing the PSP at the time. I think they were really trying a different, they were trying something else and trying something new. I think a lot of people did not like this way that Sony was going. But I think when you look at the future, what Sony was trying to do, and a lot of game manufacturers, they were going to more of a digital type of, console layout. And even now, Sony finally implemented. You have the, PlayStation 5 digital, you have the disc model. So I think this console was just ahead of its time. It was pretty crazy because it did actually have kind of like a small lifespan ahead of it. It only lasted like 2 years before they eventually they really downscaled all their, handhelds, because the PlayStation Vita didn't do that well. So the PSP Go was a really big shift, I think, of what Sony was trying to do. I'm still happy I have mine, but let's go and see kind of how this console even kind of was started. So the PSP lineup came out many years before this thing came out, and that was a great console. I like the PSPs a lot. You're getting a fairly large display, it was fairly portable, very good graphics, and overall it was like a very good console. I liked it a lot. The PSP Go, its main selling point, I would say, it's kind of the couple things going for it, but the main thing was that it did have a gimmick of like sliding up and down. So with this console, you were basically able to go and slide the screen up and slide the screen down, depending if that's something you wanted to do. So it kind of gave it a more portable type of aspect. And I do think this was really much in focus from what Nintendo was doing. Nintendo had this like flipping architecture with the display, and you can close it. I think Sony couldn't copy that exact same thing verbatim, so they decided to go ahead and just have this sliding mechanism instead, which I think was probably it could have been a more interesting choice. But when you look around this console, you do have the display up front, which I think was either the same size or slightly smaller than the PSP at the time. It still had the keys that you could normally use. It had your joystick at the very bottom, but it was a much different layout. You were getting the D-pad and the standard buttons, and this PSP could almost do everything the other PSP could do, except maybe like minus one thing. But I will say that architecture of sliding was either hit or miss. Either people liked it or they didn't like it. And personally for me, I think I didn't like it at that time, but I did end up liking it over time. But definitely at that moment, this was probably one of those areas which was, again, kind of hit or miss for a lot of people. So kind of keep that in mind. It's definitely not like the end of the world or anything, but that was one of those things that when I looked at this particular console, it was one of those things that may have irked a lot of people at that moment. So that right there, kind of one of those things to keep in mind there as well. However, the biggest thing that I really was kind of the biggest downgrade, I would say, for this particular console at that moment was the lack of the UMD slot. Now, for those of you who don't know, the UMD slot is basically that capability of playing games from your particular console. So Sony had removed that UMD slot on this console. So any disc, game that you were buying that was like a physical game, you could no longer play on this particular console. Now, this was a two-part thing because on one hand that happened. There's still a digital library of games that you could play. But even then, compared to all the UMD games, there were just so many more physical games available than digital games. Nowadays, it's a little tiny bit of a different story, because if you go and play like some digital games or whatever, like it's not really like the end of the world or anything, because there's so many digital games. There's like endless amounts of games. And honestly, I would say the default nowadays is to download games digitally and then go and get the disc models later on. So I think that was one thing that kind of ended up happening here and something you had to kind of keep in mind. And when I look at this particular console, I think that's kind of one of those things to keep in mind there. With this particular console though, at the other hand, with the PSP Go, this console came out at a time which was still kind of, you were still kind of stuck in this space where like it was a, mostly a physical game landscape for the most part. So if you're going through and buying this game, that was kind of the problem that you're running into. So when I look at this particular gaming console, that is the problem here, right? That was the biggest problem for the PSP Go at the time. There was still games and stuff and movies and stuff you could watch. But man, I'm going to tell you at that moment, it was not a happy sight for people when they found out that this particular gaming console removed the UMD slot. This again in and of itself, by far one of the biggest issues going on for this particular console. I still like the PSP Go a lot, but that was pretty crazy. And you also have to keep in mind this, there were still so many game developers who were making games on UMD, and the UMD games were they were all physical, obviously, you could buy them in the used market, and I don't even know where they came up with this, because Nintendo wasn't doing anything digitally yet either. It's not like they made a game console that was only digital. It's not like they made a handheld gaming console yet either that was digital either. It was all physical games always. So for them to go digitally, once again, I think they were thinking ahead and they were trying to, kind of see what was happening. I truly do think that if the concept of the PSP Go went well, let's say it sold a bunch of units and people were happy about it, I think they would have probably ended up making a digital PlayStation 3 with no disc tray. And I think that would have impacted their PlayStation 4 lineup as well, because I think they would have eventually had like some sort of like a digital model of the PlayStation 4. And this isn't so crazy because they eventually did make a digital PlayStation 5. So I think that was probably what was going to end up happening in the future, but that was a super crazy thing in and of itself too. Finally, the gaming library of the PSP Go. The thing I guess I have to give Sony some credit here is that there was a lot of games that you could still download via the PlayStation Store. So that was something that was pretty nice. So if you wanted to, you could always go through and just basically download and find some games on the PlayStation Store and download them that way. I think there was a little bit of a modding community behind this console, but that was mostly for like the first couple PlayStation Ps that came out. By the time the PSP Go came out, I will say there was a lot of interesting stuff and a lot of movement because not a lot of people ended up buying this console. So because of that, over time, this thing did end up kind of becoming like somewhat of a collector's item. And it's funny because when you actually go online and you go on like eBay or something like that, if you actually type in like PSP Go, these things are still like pretty high in value, depending on which one you get. I mean, they're still like getting closer to about $200. There's some that are pre-owned that are maybe like closer to $100 something, but usually those have issues. I still see them being sold for about $150, $130, all the way up to basically like over $200 sometimes. They're not always $200, I'll be honest, but it's really interesting how much capability is still behind here and how many people still want to go ahead and buy a PSP Go. In fact, when I'm on eBay right now, I'm seeing a lot of people, this is so funny, they're putting up their like PSP 1000, 2000, or 3000s. They're like listing those as PSP Go's, and I don't know why those are coming up here. So I will tell you from that perspective alone, there's still a lot of people who own this, these PSP Go's and are still trying to sell them or get rid of them. One thing I did like though, I did actually like the fact that you could go through and actually kind of mod these particular PSPs at the time. And the colors that you could choose from as well was actually kind of nice. You had a lot of different colors to choose from. So it was nice that you can kind of customize it there a little bit. I think overall though, like Sony was trying to do a good thing. I think there was some interesting choices and interesting stuff they decided to do. But I look at this particular console right now, and I don't really know if this is necessarily the console that I would recommend people to buy. If you're going through and just trying to like play a game or play or whatever, you are much better off either going through and actually purchasing this particular console. Maybe in like, if you're trying to do it as a collector's item, then I'd recommend buying it. As a collector's item, it's always a pretty good choice because you can always go through, just play this game, play the games on this console and kind of move on from there. I think that's a great thing if you want to have it as a collector's item. But beyond that, if you're actually planning on using this thing and kind of going down that direction, it may not make a lot of sense because you can always go through and like find an emulator, play those games via an emulator. That might be the first way to go. There's a lot of other ways to kind of go about that too, but I definitely look at the PSP Go as being one of the most interesting consoles that, Sony has ever made. So that pretty much covers it up here. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that will mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.